between stimulus and response, most creatures, when you act on them, there's almost always a direct reaction. There's no thought process, no consideration. Animals don't have a choice in their reaction. And unfortunately, some of us are like this. When somebody says something to us that upsets us, we react without thinking. However, if you notice, there is a space between the stimulus and the response. The quality of being human is that we have the freedom to choose, and recognizing that there is a space between the stimulus and the response. And this is where self-awareness, imagination, free will, creativity, conscience, choice all exist. And when we recognize this space, we recognize our humanity. Ayatollah Ibrahim Amini wrote a book called Self-Building, and in that book he says that the prophets came with the intention of awakening the human nature and to charge their unconscious self into a conscious self. They came to help, support, and to guide human beings into recognizing and pay attention to their higher moral values. In other words, they came to emphasize the important point that we're not animals. Instead, we're humans and possess the potential of being superior than the angels. So when recognize this space, it means that we have the ability to choose our response. If someone is rude to us, we can choose to be rude right back. Stimulus, response. Or we can take advantage of that space and choose a response that doesn't bring you down to their level. If you're angry, sit down before you react. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam said, "Anger is a destroyer for the heart of the wise man. He who does not have his anger under his control does not have his wisdom under his control either." What language do you use? Proactive language is the language of people who get things done. For example, a reactive person will say, "There's nothing I can do." The proactive response is, "Well, what are my options?" Reactive, "That's just the way that I am." The proactive person says, "I can choose to be different. I can't," or "I can make choices. I have to," or "I choose to. If only," or "I will." For example, sometimes we say things like, "Oh man, I have to pray now," or "I have to fast." So ask yourself, do we have to pray? Is somebody forcing us to do this action? Or is it that we choose to pray? Choosing to do something implies that you have control over your action, not someone else. So don't say, "I have to pray," or "I have to fast," but say, "I choose to pray," or "I will pray." What happens if we don't pray? Maybe nothing right away, but we'll notice that we'll slowly drift further and further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we'll lose this relationship, and we may not like the consequences. So we're not forced to pray, but yet we make a choice based on the consequences that we want to face. You may see somebody with a bad habit, and they may say things like, "Well, my culture made me this way. My experience. Our people are just like that. It's in my family. I've always done things this way. Or I can't help myself." But instead of saying, "My culture made me this way," say, "But I can change." Or, "I've always done things this way, but I can do things differently." You have to understand that the language that we use affects the path that we choose. What's in your circle? Everyone has a circle of concern. Some are large, some small. This includes all of the things that we care about, the things that touch our conscience. In our circle of concern may be social justice, the economy, politics, family, your kids, finances, war, unrest throughout the world, employment, the stock market, sports team, international affairs, what's going on in Bahrain, what's going on in Palestine, what's going on back home in crime, marriage. If we think about it, of all of the things that we're concerned about, there's only a certain amount of things that we actually have influence over. And this is known as our circle of influence. I'm concerned about the suffering of Muslims in Palestine, in Gaza. Yet, I'm not in a position to have an effect over there. What I do have influence over are my family, my community, my neighbors, my co-workers, people I can talk to and discuss and spread awareness and work towards those bigger goals. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the early days in Mecca, he worked within his circle of influence. Yes, he was concerned about the entire society, but he realized that he didn't have the influence at that time. What did he do? He worked with those closest to him until the community was built up to the point where they could have an influence on the entire society, and eventually they changed the entire world. Another example in the Quran, Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, from the well to the jail. Prophet Yusuf didn't ask to be thrown in the well. No, he didn't want to be sold into slavery. He was put into prison against his will, but yet in each one of those stages, he worked with those who were within his circle of influence. He didn't complain about his situation and cry about the things that he didn't have power over, but yet he continued to work until eventually Prophet Yusuf became the most powerful man in Egypt. Muslims, we are good about talking about the things that concern us. We can talk about the problems of the world all day long. In fact, if you were to give a Nobel Prize in talking about problems, a Muslim would win every year. But however, we sit around and talk about the problems, but sometimes we ignore what's going on in our own backyard. If we take the time to work within our circle of influence, that circle of influence we find will grow until we can have influence over all of the things that concern us. So yes, we may be concerned about the situation in Palestine, the suffering of the people in Gaza, the suffering of the people in Bahrain, of the oppression of the Muslims and the poor people throughout the world. But we may not have the power at this time to have a direct effect on those situations. So what can we do? Work with those who are closest to us, the people in our families, our neighbors, our co-workers, the people in our schools. Talk to them, spread knowledge, spread information. Inshallah, that these movements start to grow, and inshallah we will have the power to have influence over all of the things that concern us. The second type of diagram is where somebody's circle of influence is much larger than their circle of concern. And this is the diagram of the oppressors. People like Fir'aun, Yazid, they come to mind, where they have a lot of influence, they have a lot of power, they have money, they have resources, talent, but yet they're lazy, they're wasteful. They don't use it to benefit other people. So inshallah, we pray to Allah, O Allah, protect us from wasting our talents and our powers and our abilities. Inshallah, that we may put them to use in order to benefit the Muslims and the oppressed in the world. O Allah, give us the strength that we may be proactive in our daily lives and in our religion, that we may get closer to you, O Allah. Inshallah, hasten the coming of Imam Mahdi alayhi salam and make us amongst his righteous soldiers. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For more information on being proactive, please see the book Self-Building, an Islamic Guide for Spiritual Migration Towards God by Ayatollah Ibrahim Amini.